Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The arrest. It was an ordinary morning for Officer Mark Thompson as he completed his grocery shopping before his shift. A man who thrived on routine, he found comfort in the mundane, a sharp contrast to the unpredictable world of law enforcement. As he pushed his cart down the well-lit aisles, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead, Mark absent-mindedly hummed a tune. He glanced at the shopping list scrawled in his wife's increasingly hard-to-read handwriting. Whole wheat bread, he muttered to himself as he navigated the aisles. His freshly pressed uniform felt snug against his frame, his badge catching the light every now and then. Even in civilian errands, his presence as a police officer never truly left him. Just as he grabbed a loaf from the shelf, a loud commotion erupted from several aisles over. Shouts, the sound of shelves rattling, and something crashing to the floor pierced the peaceful atmosphere of the store. Mark's instincts kicked in immediately. Placing the bread back, he straightened his shoulders and moved toward the sound, his polished boots making purposeful strides on the tiled floor. As he approached the aisle, the noise became clearer, raised voices, objects being tossed or knocked over, and a girl's voice, trembling yet determined, standing out among the chaos. "Stay back!" Mark called out to the gathering onlookers, using a commanding tone that silenced murmurs of curiosity. He stepped into the aisle and froze for a moment. A teenage girl, no older than 16, stood with her back against the metal shelves. Her school uniform was neat, her braided hair pulled back, and her dark eyes darted between the adults surrounding her, a store manager and 2 employees. She held a bulging backpack tight against her chest, her chin tilted up in defiance, though the fear in her trembling fingers betrayed her. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," the manager, a stout man with a name tag reading Mr. Daniels, said. His face was flushed with a mix of relief and indignation. "We caught her trying to steal merchandise. She's got a pair of sunglasses in that backpack. Worth $200. The girl shook her head furiously. "I didn't steal anything," she cried, her voice steady but strained. "I just took my glasses off to try on a headband. They didn't even let me explain." Mark studied the scene. The employees appeared smug, clearly satisfied with their accusation. The girl, on the other hand, seemed desperate to make her case. Her backpack was stuffed with books and notebooks, the fabric worn but clean. One of the employees, a young man with fiery red hair, chimed in. "I saw her put something in her bag. She was acting sketchy in the sunglasses section." "I always come here to study," the girl said, her voice cracking slightly. "It's the only place near school with air conditioning. I wasn't doing anything wrong." The middle-aged female employee added with a sneer, "And yet, here we are, missing a pair of Ray-Bans." Mark sighed. He knew this type of situation all too well. It wasn't uncommon for shoplifters to come up with elaborate excuses, but something about this girl didn't fit the mold. Her school uniform was pristine, and her demeanor, while defensive, lacked the aggression or guilt he often encountered in thieves. Still, he had a job to do, and the expectations of those around him weighed on his shoulders. He needed to uphold the store's trust in law enforcement while ensuring that justice was served. "All right," Mark said firmly, stepping closer to the girl. "Let's check your bag. If you've got nothing to hide, this will be over quickly." Jessica, as he learned from the embroidered name on her backpack, hesitated. Her hands clutched the straps even tighter, and her gaze hardened. "No," she said defiantly. "You don't have the right to look through my things without my permission or a warrant." The crowd, now a mix of employees, customers, and onlookers, began to murmur. Mark's patience thinned. The girl's resistance, while understandable, added fuel to the fire of suspicion. "Jessica," he said, lowering his tone slightly, "if there's nothing to hide, let's resolve this quickly. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "I didn't do anything wrong," Jessica cried, her voice echoing through the aisle. "I know my rights." Mark felt a pang of frustration. The defiance of youth, combined with the fear and tension of the moment, created an electric atmosphere. He had no time to debate. Reaching for his handcuffs, he stepped forward. "Turn around, please," he said, his voice firm but devoid of malice. Jessica froze, her expression one of disbelief and growing panic. "Are you serious?" she whispered. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, some onlookers pulling out their phones to record. The metallic click of the cuffs seemed deafening. As Mark gently but firmly led Jessica out of the aisle, the store employees exchanged triumphant looks. Yet, Mark couldn't shake the unease that settled in his gut. Something about this didn't feel right, but he had done what protocol demanded. "Come on," he muttered, escorting her to the front of the store. "We'll sort this out at the station." Jessica's silence was chilling, her eyes scanning the growing crowd. Mark noticed that despite her visible fear, there were no tears. Instead, her gaze was piercing, almost as if she knew something he didn't. What should have been a routine arrest was about to turn into the most pivotal moment of Mark Thompson's career, and he had no idea how much his world was about to change. A desperate call for help. The drive to the station was silent, but not the kind of silence Mark was used to. It wasn't the nervous quiet of someone caught in the act, nor was it the aggressive posturing of someone trying to act tough. Jessica sat in the back seat of the patrol car, her hands cuffed loosely in front of her, staring out the window. Her expression was unreadable, a mix of defiance, fear, and something Mark couldn't quite place. Mark stole glances at her in the rearview mirror, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. The unease he'd felt earlier had grown. Something about this situation didn't sit right, but he pushed the thought aside. He had done his job, followed procedure. Yet, the image of her school bag, overstuffed with books and notebooks, nagged at him. "Got anything you want to say?" Mark finally asked, breaking the silence. Jessica didn't respond at first. Her gaze remained fixed on the passing streets. Then, after a long pause, she said, "You already decided I'm guilty. What's the point?" Mark sighed, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "Look, this isn't about me deciding anything. The store reported you, and I'm doing my job. If you're innocent, we'll figure that out." Jessica turned her head to face him, her eyes locking onto his in the mirror. "Will you? Or are you just going to keep assuming I'm lying because it's easier?" Her words hit harder than he expected, but before he could respond, the radio crackled to life. "Unit 3, we've got a 10 to 50 on Route 17. Possible injuries reported. Backup requested." Mark instinctively reached for the radio. "Copy that, dispatch. En route." He glanced back at Jessica. "Looks like we'll have to make a stop." The patrol car's lights and sirens flickered to life as Mark changed course, heading toward the reported accident. As they approached the scene, the severity of the situation became clear. A sedan had collided head-on with a utility pole, its front end crumpled like an accordion. Smoke billowed from the engine, and a faint orange glow suggested a potential fire. Mark parked at a safe distance, his training kicking in immediately. Grabbing the fire extinguisher from the trunk, he turned to Jessica. "Stay here," he ordered firmly. But Jessica didn't respond. Her eyes were wide as she stared at the wreck. Mark followed her gaze and noticed what had captured her attention, a child, no older than 6, trapped in the back seat of the wrecked car. The boy's small hands pressed against the shattered window, his face pale and streaked with tears. Mark's pulse quickened. He didn't have time to wait for backup. He sprinted toward the vehicle, shouting to the bystanders who had gathered, "Everyone stay back. The car might catch fire." The driver, a woman in her 30s, was unconscious, her head resting against the deflated airbag. Mark tried the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The frame was too damaged. "Ma'am," he called out, tapping on the window. "Can you hear me?" No response. He glanced at the child, who was sobbing uncontrollably, his small fists banging against the glass. Mark grabbed the extinguisher and smashed it against the driver's window until it shattered. Carefully, he reached inside to check the woman's pulse. It was faint but steady. He needed to get her and the boy out, fast. Hold on, buddy, Mark said to the boy, trying to keep his voice calm, despite the panic rising in his chest. I'm going to get you out of here. He moved to the back door and tried to open it, but it was stuck as well. The orange glow beneath the hood grew brighter, and the acrid smell of burning oil filled the air. Officer? Mark turned to see Jessica standing outside the patrol car. I told you to stay in the car, he barked. There's no time, she shot back, her voice sharp and urgent. The fire's spreading. Mark didn't have the energy to argue. He returned his focus to the boy. Using his baton, he shattered the back window, careful to avoid the child as shards of glass rained down. Okay, kid, he said, reaching in. I've got you. The boy clung to him as Mark pulled him free. He handed the child to a bystander and turned back to the driver. The flames were now licking at the edges of the engine, and the heat was becoming unbearable. Sir, the woman. Jessica called out, her voice rising with urgency. Mark hesitated for a split second, weighing the risks. But before he could act, Jessica ran toward him. What are you doing? He shouted. Helping, she snapped, grabbing the extinguisher from the ground. Jessica aimed it at the fire, squeezing the handle with more determination than Mark expected. The foam sprayed out, momentarily keeping the flames at bay. Mark used the opportunity to pull the driver out of the car. As he dragged her to safety, he turned to Jessica. Let's go, he yelled. Jessica dropped the extinguisher and sprinted after him as the car erupted into flames behind them. The heat was intense, and the sound of the explosion was deafening. They reached the bystanders, who were now tending to the boy and his mother. Mark collapsed onto the pavement, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Jessica stood a few feet away, her hands on her knees, sweat dripping from her brow. Despite everything, her expression was calm, almost triumphant. Mark stared at her, a mix of disbelief and gratitude washing over him. You didn't have to do that, he said finally. Jessica straightened, meeting his gaze with an intensity that made him feel small. And you didn't have to arrest me, she replied. For the first time in his career, Mark was at a loss for words. Shattering prejudices. The smoke still lingered in the air as Officer Mark Thompson leaned against the side of his patrol car, watching paramedics tend to the injured woman and her son. Jessica stood nearby, her school uniform stained with soot and her braids slightly disheveled. Despite her youthful frame and the cuffs that still bound her wrists, she carried herself with a strength Mark couldn't ignore. For a moment, the chaos faded into the background, and all Mark could see was the girl who had rushed into danger to save lives, while still shackled by the literal and figurative chains society had placed on her. Jessica broke the silence first. Are you going to stand there and stare, or are you going to take these cuffs off? Her tone was sharp, but not unkind. It was the voice of someone who had endured too much, too soon. Mark hesitated. Protocol dictated that once someone was arrested, they remained cuffed until formally processed. But after what he had just witnessed, protocol seemed like a weak excuse. He reached for his keys and unlocked the cuffs. Jessica rubbed her wrists, wincing slightly. Thanks, she muttered, her eyes scanning the scene. Mark cleared his throat, unsure how to start. That was brave, what you did back there. Jessica shrugged, her gaze fixed on the paramedics loading the unconscious woman into the ambulance. It wasn't about being brave. It was about doing what was right. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Mark felt a pang of guilt. This girl, whom he had arrested without fully hearing her out, had just risked her life to save others. Listen, Mark began, his voice faltering slightly. I might have been too quick to judge back at the store. Jessica turned to him, her expression unreadable. You think, she said, her voice tinged with sarcasm. Mark looked down, the weight of his badge suddenly feeling heavier than usual. I'm sorry, he said, the words foreign on his tongue, but necessary. I made an assumption, and I was wrong. Jessica crossed her arms, her posture softening just a bit. It's not just you, officer. It's everyone. People see me, and they assume I'm trouble. They don't see the hours I spend studying, the scholarships I'm fighting for, or the fact that I'm just trying to make it out of this neighborhood without becoming a statistic. Her words cut deeper than Mark expected. He had spent decades as a cop, priding himself on fairness and impartiality. But in that moment, he realized how often his subconscious biases had influenced his actions. "You're right," Mark admitted. "And it's not okay." Jessica's eyes widened slightly, as though she hadn't expected him to agree. "Then what are you going to do about it?" Mark didn't have an answer. The question lingered in his mind as he turned his attention back to the scene. The fire department had arrived to extinguish the smoldering wreckage, and the onlookers were beginning to disperse. As the ambulance doors closed, the young boy, now sitting on the curb with a blanket wrapped around him, caught Jessica's eye. She approached him cautiously, kneeling down to his level. "Hey, you okay?" she asked softly. The boy nodded, his wide eyes still glassy with shock. "You helped my mom," he whispered. Jessica smiled gently. "Your mom's going to be all right. The doctors will take good care of her." The boy reached out and grabbed her hand, holding it tightly. Jessica didn't pull away, letting him find comfort in her presence. Mark watched the interaction, a lump forming in his throat. For years, he had seen himself as the protector, the hero in every situation. But here was this girl, a teenager society had labeled as trouble, showing more compassion and bravery than he had ever expected. When Jessica finally stood and walked back toward him, Mark felt the need to speak again. "I'm going to take you home," he said, his tone resolute. Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Not back to the station?" Mark shook his head. "No. I've already wasted enough of your time." Jessica seemed taken aback, but nodded. "All right. But if you're driving me, we're stopping at the store first. I'm getting my glasses back." A small smile tugged at Mark's lips, despite himself. "Fair enough." The drive to the store was quiet, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence from earlier. Mark found himself glancing at Jessica in the rearview mirror, trying to piece together the life of the girl who had upended his assumptions. "Why do you always study at the store?" he asked, breaking the silence. Jessica shrugged. "It's the only place nearby where I can concentrate. My house is noisy. My mom works 2 jobs, and my little brother has special needs. It's hard to focus with everything going on." Mark nodded, a new layer of guilt settling in. He had spent years judging people based on surface impressions, never stopping to consider the struggles they might be facing. When they arrived at the store, Mr. Daniels greeted them with surprise and suspicion. "What's going on here?" the manager asked, his eyes darting between Mark and Jessica. "I need you to check your security footage," Mark said firmly. "Now." Mr. Daniels hesitated but complied. In the back office, they reviewed the footage. It clearly showed Jessica in the sunglasses section, taking off her own glasses and placing them in her bag before trying on a headband. There was no theft, no suspicious behavior, just a girl doing exactly what she had said she was doing. Mr. Daniels looked sheepish as the video ended. "Well, I suppose there's been a misunderstanding," he muttered. Jessica crossed her arms. "A misunderstanding that almost got me arrested." Mark stepped in. "And that's on me as much as it is on him." "Jessica, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you better." Jessica didn't respond immediately, her expression contemplative. Finally, she nodded. "You can start by making sure this doesn't happen to someone else." Mark nodded solemnly. "I will." As they left the store, Jessica paused at the door. "You know, officer, for someone who messed up pretty badly, you're not half bad." Mark chuckled, the tension finally easing. "Coming from you, I'll take that as a compliment." They walked to the patrol car together, 2 people from vastly different worlds who had found a moment of understanding in the chaos. A new mission. The drive to Jessica's house was quiet, but the silence felt different now, less strained, more reflective. Officer Mark Thompson couldn't shake the day's events from his mind. Jessica, sitting in the passenger seat now, stared out the window, lost in her own thoughts. "Where's home?" Mark asked, glancing at her. "Cedarwood Apartments," Jessica replied, her tone matter-of-fact. "It's about 10 minutes from here. You can drop me off near the main gate." Mark frowned. Cedarwood had a reputation, a low-income complex plagued by underfunding and neglect. It was the kind of place he associated with trouble, yet it was also a home for families doing their best to survive against the odds. "You don't want me to walk you to your door?" he asked. Jessica turned her head, her expression a mix of amusement and exasperation. "Let's just say having a cop escort me isn't exactly great for my reputation." Mark chuckled, despite himself. "Fair point." As they neared Cedarwood, Mark couldn't help but notice the worn-down buildings, the cracked sidewalks, and the kids playing in the street with makeshift toys. It was a stark reminder of a world he had seen but never truly understood. An unexpected invitation. When they arrived at the gate, Jessica surprised him. "Actually, you can walk me up if you want," she said hesitantly. Mark raised an eyebrow. "I thought it wasn't great for your reputation?" Jessica shrugged. "My mom might want to meet the cop who almost arrested me today." Mark winced. "Fair enough." They walked up to her building, the stairs creaking under their weight. Jessica led him to a door with peeling paint and a faintly glowing porch light. She knocked twice before stepping inside. "Mom? I'm home," she called. A woman appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked exhausted but managed a warm smile when she saw Jessica. Her smile faltered, however, when her eyes landed on Mark. "What's this about?" her mother asked, her voice guarded. Jessica hesitated. "It's a long story. But this is Officer Thompson. He's the one who, well, let's just say he brought me home." Mark extended a hand, feeling awkward under the woman's sharp gaze. "Ma'am. I just wanted to apologize for the misunderstanding earlier today." Her mother didn't take his hand but gave him a curt nod. "Misunderstanding, huh?" She looked at Jessica. "You okay, baby?" Jessica nodded. "Yeah, Mom. I'm fine. It's handled." The tension in the room eased slightly, and Jessica's mom sighed. "All right. Well, thank you for bringing her back." Mark nodded. "Of course. And, if it's all right, I'd like to follow up. Make sure everything's truly sorted out." Jessica smirked. "You mean you want to make sure I don't run off with another pair of sunglasses?" Mark couldn't help but laugh. "I think we both know I owe you more credit than that." A catalyst for change. Later that evening, Mark sat in his living room, staring at his badge on the coffee table. The day's events played over and over in his mind, the assumptions he'd made, the way Jessica had stepped up when it mattered, and the uncomfortable truths she had spoken. For years, he had prided himself on being a fair and just officer, but today had exposed the blind spots he hadn't been willing to see. Jessica wasn't just a teenager trying to navigate a difficult world, she was a symbol of resilience and courage. And he had almost failed her. Mark made a decision. He couldn't change the past, but he could use it as a stepping stone to build a better future. Taking action. The next morning, Mark arrived at the precinct early. He met with his captain and requested to start a community outreach initiative, one focused on bridging the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. "Something happened yesterday," Mark explained. "Something that made me realize how much work we need to do, not just to enforce the law, but to build trust." The captain raised an eyebrow. "You think you're the one to lead this?" "I know I am," Mark said firmly. "Because I saw how easy it is to get it wrong. And I want to make sure we start getting it right." The captain nodded. "All right, Thompson. Let's see what you can do." Building bridges. Over the next few weeks, Mark poured himself into the new initiative. He visited schools, hosted community events, and even organized a mentorship program pairing officers with local teens. Jessica, to his surprise, became one of the program's first participants. "You sure you want me involved?" she asked skeptically during their first meeting. Mark grinned. "Let's just say I owe you one." Jessica smirked. "You owe me more than one, officer." Their partnership grew into a friendship, one built on mutual respect and understanding. Together, they worked to create a dialogue between the police and the community, a dialogue that had been missing for far too long. A life changed. Months later, as Mark stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new community center, he spotted Jessica in the crowd. She gave him a small wave, her expression proud. Mark smiled. She had reminded him of something he had forgotten along the way, that being a cop wasn't just about enforcing laws, it was about protecting people, lifting them up, and making a difference. As the crowd applauded and the ribbon fell, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just an officer anymore. He was part of a community, and he owed that to a brave young girl who had taught him the true meaning of justice.